And thank you guys very, very much for joining me on stage here at the closing plenary. We're supposed to be discussing collaboration, and I can't imagine discussing organizing collaboration with any three people better than you guys. But let me start with you, Jose, because you're sitting right next to me. What about what I said about race and discrimination?
What about what you said about race?
How important is that to everything that you're dealing with? Is that something that in your community in New Mexico that you're constantly struggling with? Is that something that you have to think about and work around?
You know, it's interesting. We actually had a conversation about this morning with myself and Ellen Bernstein, who's in the audience right now with the Albuquerque Teachers Federation. So I've had a chance to live in 7 states, 11 cities, and 3 countries, and race is always a hot topic on there. But I've been in New Mexico for the past 9 years, and there's a couple of things that popped out to me when we talk about institutional racism. First, I was very fortunate to realize that I am actually in a minority-majority state. Now, the hard part about that, being 6'4", a lot of this Hispanic population, is hard to buy pants. But to get to that...
Your struggle, sir.
Yes, the struggle
so
there...
So tall and handsome.
The struggle in New Mexico. Yeah, Pete. The struggle in New Mexico.
I'm sorry, I'm of average build. I don't know what to tell you.
The struggle in New Mexico is because there are so many minority leaders there from my perspective.
Yeah.
They have an opportunity to really break down the walls of the institutional racism, but yes, it still exists there. But there's also a struggle in the culture and bringing cultures involved, and especially being in one of the states who are really struggling and economically disadvantaged, we're beginning to see more and more poverty-divided lines. So I think this...
Tamika, you were born into a family of activists. Both your mom and dad were activists working with Reverend Sharpton's network, yep, if I'm not mistaken. So you've been living this stuff your whole life. So, you know, similar question to you, take it however you want, but where are we at? How are we doing? 3 steps forward, 2 steps back, how do you frame it?
I think a little bit of all of that. I do think, first of all, I want to thank AFT for having me here today, and also to thank this great union and all of you who are here who attended the Women's March for helping to make it what it was. Yesterday was actually the 6-month anniversary of the Women's March, and so we're in a very reflective and special space right now. And, you know, I think we have taken steps back and forward. And I'd say that because the backwards is obviously the administration that we have today represents everything that we don't want, right? Like, it's just from the top to the bottom, it doesn't even make sense to sit here and talk about all the things that's wrong, because everybody here already knows we fight it every day. But the steps forward have been the unity among us and the fact that people are starting to work together, because we realize that we're not going to be able to really challenge the system without having a very coordinated response and having people who generally have not paid attention to issues that were not their own. So if you were, you know, if you're a teacher, it didn't matter really what was happening in the reproductive rights struggle, or maybe even in the criminal justice space. But I think what we've been able to do is to get people to start paying attention to this thing called intersectionality, so that we realize that the movement, in order for it to work, it's gonna have to be big as the machine that we're fighting against. So I think that's the steps back and then the steps forward. And sometimes, you know, you have to actually go through the trauma. It's like, in order to actually have a baby, there is some pain, and then there's a beautiful baby that comes forth. So hopefully that's the period that we're in, the labor process, and that this will birth a new America.
Awesome answer. JOHNAE, you work in Chicago, and you also traveling around doing a lot of different things and organizing activism. We hear a lot about Chicago in the news. Obviously, we never hear in the news all the amazing, awesome things that happen all the time, because that's what is usually happening, but we hear about the bad things, obviously the violence. How, since you became basically a full-time organizer and activist, how do you think it's working in Chicago and countrywide? How are you doing?
Chicago is a really beautiful place for a lot of things. I mean, it has a magnetism to it. It's kind of like the city you love and the city you hate, because there's these 2 histories. So when you think about Tale of Two Cities, that's Chicago. So we have this long arc of generational systemic injustice, systemic disinvestment from communities. Like our police force is one of the ones that has been like basically infamous for the ways in which they brutalize young people, and that's something that has been a historical thing. But then on the other side of Chicago, you see that, I mean, the Solidarity and Labor March in May 1 that we do every year started in Chicago. So there's been a lot of oppression that's happened, but there's also been a lot of resistance, a lot of brilliance, a lot of creativity. You think about the arts, you think about that kind of like undercurrent, that counterculture has been very consistently strong. So when I think about Chicago today, it's always within that historical framework that I have to understand it, that as long as there's been people who have been there kind of claiming autonomy and claiming collectivism and claiming the will to create the world that they want to exist, there's also the hegemonic structure that wants to basically make folks complicit. So today in Chicago, it's that same tension that's definitely going back and forth. But I love what TAMIKA said, because it's a lot of folks who are realizing, okay, we do have to take some steps back and really claim and own our indigenous ways of being with each other in order to move that much more forward to change the history.
I mean, I've spent the last 2 weeks preparing to interview these 3 people, so I'm not blown away. But how amazing, just in the first answer from all 3 of these people. You just used so many big words. Yeah. I don't even know half what you just said. I was like, man, I should have stayed in school myself. Yeah. My associate's degree is not helping right now. I mean, I'm blown away by all 3 of you. It's so. Let's talk specifics though. Let's get real specific about what you're doing and zero in on, and anybody jump in anytime, obviously. But Jose, talk to me about. You raised a lot of money for community schools in New Mexico. You've gotten some great accolades because you've had some pretty impressive triumphs. But what is the challenge? Is it resources? Is it bringing people together? Is it confronting bigotry? Is it confronting big money that you don't have as much as the opponents? What is the most, and give me something specific, difficult challenge and how you've overcome it there in New Mexico?
Well, in our work in New Mexico, one of the ABC Community Schools partnerships' main responsibility is to help give capacity and create capacity for local communities to do their own decision making, for them to begin to bring their educators, their community partners, and their family members together. So within that, the challenge is really the politics of personalities and the personal agendas. And what I mean by that, I, on a daily basis, get a chance to work with our elected officials, work with our corporate America, small businesses, and community organizations and unions. So I get a chance to work in that. So with that, the difficulty is really just establishing and maintaining the relationship. Resource-wise, I think money is important to get things done, it is, but I think resource-wise, I think sometimes we unintentionally just don't pay as much attention to the ability of relationships and what people can bring to the table as far as assets when it comes to serving our young people. So within that, the ABC Community School Partnership, so we were able to, in the last 5 years, the money piece of it, grow the capacity to serve people from about 300%. And so over that. Now, what does that take? What does that take? It takes a lot of relationship building, but then on our board, just so you can familiarize you with what we're working with. On our board is this 12-member board, 7 of them are elected officials and others are high-level decision makers. At that table, what we really strive for is not to have a traditional school board meeting or city council meeting or county commission meeting. We want to invite the community to think with those decision makers at that table. What that has done, as they begin to think with community members, such as our unions, when they begin to think with them, they begin to understand how they could more equitably and efficiently and effectively use their resources that they're making decisions on, that they're elected to make decisions on day to day. So creating that space at that 30,000-foot level is important. What that has done is help us grow from 1 community school to 4 to now 26 community schools. Thank you. That gets challenged. We're heating up in our mayoral race right now, which is the vote is in October. That gets challenged. We just had a city councilor come out and threaten that funding. And I would call it not so much the person, but the action is what my job is, to mobilize our community around and educate them And so they can begin to educate that person if they happen to become mayor, that this is how this money is helping people who are usually disempowered by barriers to participation. And so then the capacity piece on that, that's the biggest difficulty, is the politics, personal agendas, and personality. So it takes not just myself, but it takes the people working at the schools, building those relationships.
When you talk about personalities, you know, Tamika, like, take us inside the organizing of the Women's March, and let's say it's all like-minded women, if you will. There had to have been fights. There had to have been disputes. There had to have been power struggles, even though everybody wanted, you know, to create this amazing movement and march. I mean, did that happen? And if so, when you have especially a bunch of strong personalities, passionate people, how do you deal with that to get to the right goal? Is that something that you had to struggle with?
Yeah. First of all, I just want to take panelist privilege and ask for some tissue, because I don't know about y'all, but I'm freezing in this room, and my nose is running, and I need some tissue at this point.
How about one of those cloth napkins?
I think no. Young lady went to go get something. So thank you all.
Do you mind, sir? Did you?
I'm probably not going to use the tissue that this thing.
It's unused. All right.
Probably not going to use.
So what about?
So the tension piece is real. So I think when you were asking what was, you asked the question at first, thank you, awesome sauce. Can
we get a small, yes,
yeah,
thank you, perfect.
So you asked the question, what was something that was a challenge and how did we deal with it? And in line with that would be the same thing in terms of all the different personalities. I think people don't necessarily realize or think about the fact that the Women's March was organized by a bunch of folks who never met one another, right? So usually when you're doing something that big, you go get your A-team, right? You get the folks you know, people, even if you don't necessarily work with them every day, but you know something about them and there's some type of relationship. But in the Women's March space, we didn't have that. We didn't even have the opportunity to bring together a team of all people that we knew. We had to just take whatever was at the table when we got there and then add on. And of course, they were incredible minds. We had some of the top experts in the country among this plus 100 team of people who came together to build this thing. But there certainly were people who thought that the challenges that we were trying to address started with Donald Trump. Like, they were like, oh my God, you know, we've got to get Trump.
Right, the people who woke up on November 8th.
Right, and we were like, no. Trump is like the grandson and great-grandson and nephew of isms that have existed in this country since like the beginning of forever and ever and ever. Like, we came here under these isms. And so then you're dealing with people all across the country who saw a Facebook post, didn't know who was behind it, and they were like, yeah, we're going to the Women's March. And then all of a sudden they were like, well, okay, well, wait a minute, what is the Women's March? and so then we started telling them, oh, we're going to talk about racism, we're going to talk about sexism, we're going to talk about criminal justice, we're going to talk about ending mass incarceration. They were like, wait, no, I didn't want to talk about that. I thought we were going to talk about, like, I want to be able to have my abortion. I don't want anyone to take my right away to choose. And, you know, we want quality education and that, but all that other stuff, you know, that's that radical stuff. We don't want to get into that stuff. And we were like, no, actually, what you have to understand is that racism is like undergirding all these issues. So if we don't address that, if we don't have these difficult conversations about how race plays out in America and how it actually played into this particular election cycle, then we're never going to get there. So they were like, well, what do you mean by that? So we said, well, just so happened that 53% of white women, your family members probably, supposedly voted for Donald Trump, right? And they said, well, you know, what do we do about that? You know, it wasn't me. I'm a part of the 47%. And we said, no, you actually are a part of the 100%. And I'll tell you why. Because on Labor Day, which is the weekend in September prior to election, What conversations were you having with your mom and your aunts, the people, your family members, when you were at the picnic table? Or did you have this mindset that, you know, we don't talk about race, we don't talk about politics, we don't get into those discussions, and then you don't even know that your mother was actually planning on voting for Donald Trump because you didn't ask her? You didn't feel the need to have a difficult conversation that may make, you know, might blow up the whole reunion. But it's necessary.
Yep.
Because for us, for black women, 94% of us who, whether we liked Hillary Clinton or not, we voted for her. And the difference with us was that we got on the phone and called down south like, you know, you got your papers, like everything's straight down there. You know, does Ray Ray have all his stuff together? Does he know that he can actually vote even though he may have a felony conviction? His state,
come on,
you know, will allow him to vote. Does he know, is everybody registered? Does everyone have their papers? Yeah, I know we don't like Hillary Clinton because Bill Clinton had the crime bill and the whole thing, but we don't have time for that right now. We had those conversations. And so a difficult part of the work was getting people, thank you, and now I get a blanket, which I appreciate.
It's a tiny, tiny blanket.
You know, and so a difficult part of the organizing was the fact that some of us were triggered in a real way. Like we were walking around feeling like, no, this isn't just like a terrible moment in history. Our people are going to die.
Right.
As a result of this, there's going to be a continuation.
But Hillary gave a speech to Wall Street.
No, but listen.
come on.
What we didn't even want to talk about Hillary. See, that was the difficulty.
Right.
We were trying to get people past Hillary.
Right.
We were like, let's go talk about Jim Crow, though. And it was very difficult.
Yeah.
So it was difficult, but what I will say is that 5 million people across the world said, I got it. I'm coming anyway.
Oh, yeah.
It was difficult. The conversation, I didn't necessarily feel comfortable with it, but I hear you, and I'm going to show up on behalf of other people and other issues that may not have mattered to me in the past.
Yeah. And did they show up?
Wow.
Did they show up? All over the world they showed up. People that had never, ever paid attention to politics because of you and all your colleagues just, I mean, it was amazing. And to have my two daughters at the march in New York and all of your kids, it was an unbelievable day, and it didn't stop there. JOHNAE, anything to add to anything that they said? And what about the work that you're doing specifically in Chicago in terms of what the specific challenges are? I was reading so much about your work, and I wanted to cite this one quote, but I'll get to it when you're talking here as I find it. But tell me specifically what you've had to overcome and how, again, same thing with TAMIKA, you're working with people that share your values, that understand the obstacles. These people are not ignorant. They're wide awake. They've lived it. But yet, they're arguing with you about the tactics, about how to accomplish what you both see as the same goal. So anything about any of those issues or struggles and how you accomplish them, overcome them.
Yeah, so the work that I do now is I'm coordinator for a coalition that's really beautiful because it's community groups and it's also the Chicago Teachers Union. So this is labor and community coming together. And the way that it kind of started is that my work with BYP 100 with Black Lives Matter was like really creating this current of young people. Just
BYP 100, I just learned about that. And just tell everybody in case they want to get involved what that is. It's really fascinating.
Yeah, absolutely. BYP 100 is a member-based organization of direct action activists, and it's 18 to 35, all young Black people doing political engagement and direct action.
I interrupted you to define that, but get involved with that. So yeah, you're working with these organizations together.
Yeah, so we were doing a lot of work and we were creating a current, and one of our priorities was around state violence, and specifically state violence against Black women and femmes and gender nonconforming folks. And so one such case that we were really focusing on was the case around Rekia Boyd, who was a 22-year-old Black woman who was murdered by police officer Dante Servin, and she was just like outside of her home hanging out with friends at 2 in the morning, and this police officer shot and killed her. And so we have been going to the headquarters for the Chicago Police Department month after month, packing it out, being engaged, doing protests, doing actions, collaborating with folks who were coming to those meetings that actually had a lot of different perspectives. So going to Tamika's point, there was a lot of uncomfortable conversations, but I think we all can basically contend with the fact that folks should not be murdered, you know, for hanging out with their friends. And so we have been going and doing that month after month, and we have become aware that there was a high school, the only open enrollment high school in the south side of Chicago, and it was being threatened to be closed by Rahm, who closing schools is, you know, his forte. So we found out that that was happening, and we actually took our march from the headquarters and we marched to that high school. And we had Brother Jitu, who's a giant in the organizer community of Chicago and nationally. He came and he spoke, and it was like a really spiritual experience. Like you saw people who were thinking about police violence and state violence, and then we had to intersect that with now thinking about education justice, right? And so we were building momentum, like these things are connected. What could have happened if Laquan had been supported in his community, with his community school, if he had community institutions, if he was not seen as a moving target by the police department that's supposed to serve his community, right? So we were starting to see that these issues go together. And so things just started to keep moving, and then April 1, 2 years ago, I believe it was 2016 or 2015, I'm forgetting now, we had the one-day march where we were shutting down the city. And so the CTA workers, the trains, the buses, the teachers union, the SEIU health workers and nurses, teachers, Black Youth Project 100, BLM Chicago, like all these groups, right? We came together and we were basically showing solidarity with one another. And it was the same type of thing. We were having this rally and we were saying that the policies that are being enacted in Chicago are anti-immigrant, they're anti-Black, they're anti-poor. This is affecting all of us. But we had moments on that stage where there was comments that were in complete and transparent contradiction with each other. And so then that taught us we need to come back together and have some organizers meetings and talk about this. And not talk about, okay, what's the tactic, what's the end goal, but let's do some political education. What does it mean when we're talking about Philando Castile and we're talking about the officer being a Latino person, right? What does that mean? How do we unpack that? And how do we not make a conclusion, but how do we talk about it? And so we've been doing a lot of that. And so that led up to an organizers conference we did this past March to lead up to a May 1, where we could actually have some true solidarity and not have these moments where we have to debrief and say, oh, wait, no, I wasn't really rocking with that issue. I thought we were just talking about this. And so now we're at a point where we're trying to move back towards getting that action to be a completely like united front.
So it occurred to me while you were talking that we so often think of, you know, kind of, I guess, first responders as heroes who save lives. And yet, all three of you, and probably most of you, have saved so many lives by your interventions and by your work. And I just want to point out, well, I don't think we think about that, because you don't think that if you intervene with this child, with this person, if someone intervened somehow, could have helped Laquan McDonald, that would have saved a life. But I guess we probably don't know just how many lives the three of you and all of you have saved. And I just wanted to point out that not only are you organizers and educators and activists, but in many ways, you've saved so many lives, and I think that's pretty amazing. So what about... So I host a national radio show, and I guess because of that, I focus so much on national stuff, national issues, national politics. But I think that, you know, because of the national media and so much of the, you know, the issues that obviously in the federal government here in the swamp, we focus on the president, we focus on Congress, and yet when I talk to all you guys, what I hear is, no, we're getting amazing things done in our local communities. How important is it to, as distracting as that can be, the national conversation, whatever the president tweeted today, whatever Congress is passing or health care they're trying to take away, how important is it for all of us to focus on what we can do locally? Can we really get more done, as you have in New Mexico, locally than being distracted by what's happening at the federal level?
Well, and first, it's amazing to hear these two young ladies' story and how they began to address those. Because to start, if you're if you're hearing the same thing I'm hearing, how it started off very local and began to create this groundswell for a common vision, a common goal. The same things happen in community schools. I mean, there's racism, domestic violence, violence on others, crime going up, so many different inequities from participation, or barriers to participation for young people and their families. So within the community schools intentionally pursue equity. So they engage those people who are the ones who are disempowered from those barriers of participation in the conversation of decision making. And so when locally, what teachers can do, I learned, first of all, my mother's a retired educator as well, like yours. My wife and I are now her caregivers, so I get a chance to learn from her. So my first experience of getting involved locally was very engaging. So first of all, is opening up the classrooms. I think opening up the classrooms, opening up the knowledge that you all have in this room right here, and begin to share that with a group of community members and family members, and talking to people to find out what exactly are those root cause, those isms you talk about for your own neighborhood, and begin to sit down and think with them. That's something that we can do right now.
What do you mean opening classroom? Bringing people from the community into the classroom so they can see?
Bringing people in the community classrooms. When I look back when I was a teenager and go visit my mother, and I see community schools across the country now, being a Coalition for Community Schools steering committee member, I see teachers opening up their classrooms, inviting people in to address some of the social barriers, but also how do we engage children in our instructional time, and those people who have the ability to do that. I get a chance to see how a group of teachers and decision makers, local decision makers, begin to create pathways for economic development in early childhood, workforce development for parents and families, GED classes, ESL classes. We do those things, and we do some work, we do some great, have some great outcomes individually, but what I've seen within the community schools framework, when you have that on-the-ground organizer, that person who is very intentional about creating a bridge between the school and the community and facilitating a decision-making process, you see some great innovative programs and services come out from that. But even more so, it just doesn't affect the classroom. Too many times we point the finger at the classroom and teachers, and we're ignoring the social barriers that our children are going through. So the community school framework is designed to break down those barriers.
You got to strike at the root.
Yeah.
But same question for you guys, in terms of local versus national, in terms of we get so distracted and so focused on the big laws and the big, federal government issues, and that's what media certainly obviously pays attention to because that's what gets ratings. What is the difference in terms of what you can do locally in Chicago and New York, and both of you obviously now working all over the country?
Go first. Yeah. So sweet. Locally, I think, honestly, I love you talking about community schools because what Grassroots Education Movement and CTU have done is this really cool model that I'm really love talking about. So CTU won in its contract to get 22 to 55 community schools actually to be funded by the Chicago School Board. And what they did is that they said, instead of the folks who are in the bargaining team in the labor union being the ones to negotiate that, we're gonna have community groups who have been fighting for this. So some of the folks who are fighting for diet, some of the folks who are doing community schools work already in their local communities, they're gonna be the ones at the negotiation table. They're gonna be the ones rolling out the implementation model. They're gonna be the ones to be having those kind of jobs and trying to figure out what the links need to be. Does it need to be a community resource person, an organizer, like you said? And so I think it's a really beautiful example of collaboration. And going back to the local piece, I just always want to lift up those really big giants who don't get recognized. So the folks who are already in their communities doing this work who don't have an official title. So when I think about Chicago, there's this group that I love talking about. It's called Men and Mothers Against Senseless Killings. And they actually kind of combat this whole narrative of, is it state violence that we need to focus on, or is it interpersonal violence? Because y'all are killing each other too. And what they do is they actually post up on their block and they provide food, they provide community and fellowship with the young people, and they make sure they do cop watches, make sure nobody is, harassing the youth. And they also deflect interpersonal violence as well. And so this group has actually built on multiple blocks. They've gone to Tennessee, they've New York, and I just think that that's also an awesome example of collaboration. This just started from a mother who was I'll watch my kids. That's what I do as a mother. And so just thinking about that as being like the most basic model, and that just came from a mama in her home caring about her child. And I think sometimes we go so macro and we look at the behemoth that's multi-headed and we say, oh my God, we need to have like this 30-page theoretical, intellectualized approach to how we get there. But there are some indigenous ways that we know how to relate to each other that can humanize us, create more intimate connections, and spark creativity that is connected to what we know is common sense. Like, they've got us in this system of feeling like we're crazy, and when we say common sense stuff, it doesn't make sense to the mainstream narrative, but we need to start being more confident and bold in those type of declarations of how we can connect to each other.
When, I remember when President Obama was running for office the first time, and then throughout his tenure, critics always criticized him because all he was a community organizer. And when I sit down next to the three of you and hear you talk, I'm like, somebody's gonna be a mayor, governor, or president here. We're getting the rap signal, but I really just want, I was really hoping to get to, and just real quick, if anybody can just real quick talk about messaging. You know, the forces we're up against, especially the big corporate forces, they bring psychologists into a room and they create a message and a brand, and they bring focus groups in and they test it and they see what works. It's important, I think we can agree, to have a message, a succinct message. We've got one here this week at AFT, Reclaim and Resist, right? How important is messaging for what you guys are doing? Because you guys have said a lot of really intellectual, really important, thoughtful things, but in the end, how do we minimize that to a message to get people on board with everything that you're said?
So I think messaging is very important. I mean, from the Women's March perspective, we had to have messaging around the fact that we weren't going to get a permit. Like, that was like the big news. It ended up being on the cover of the Washington Post, which I've never seen anything as crazy as that happen in my life. I've been organizing for men all my life, and they've never been asked if they have a permit. Women did a march. You know, is it going to be safe? Are we going to have a permit or whatever? So messaging is obviously important, but I do think that I have an obligation, being the mother of an 18-year-old young black boy, to talk about messaging from teachers to our kids, right? And so I feel that, you know, my son, when he comes home and he's learning from an educator, his ears are open the most when he's hearing about his culture and who he is as a person and who his people are and were outside of what is being currently taught in the system. And I think that one of the very basic things that can happen in the classroom is that our teachers will begin to push back on this European-focused education system and ensure that the messaging that our children are hearing is less of the anti-blackness, anti-Muslim, anti-immigrant, but more about the beautiful anti-women and all those things. It's more about the beautiful and powerful stories of how all of us make up this wonderful country and world that we live in. And
what does an American look like?
What does it look like? And I think people have to be okay with the fact that, listen, this stuff was written before me. I don't have to own it. It's not my responsibility. I didn't do anything wrong, but I am doing something wrong if I don't realize that this young boy is not just out of his mind, won't listen, has ADHD, needs, you know, all these things that we place on our children, rather than he just needs someone to talk to him as the king in which he is.
Oh. Messaging. What's a message that works? How important is it once you've gotten everything?
Did you not hear that? No. That was awesome.
That was pretty impressive. What about you, though? What do you think about just the messaging component of the work that you're doing?
Well, just following Tamika, I'm a father.
Good luck.
Father of 5, right? Thanks. Father of 5 and a brand new grandmother. So, and I get a chance. I've been working with young people across the country now for 20 years, and is a common thread when it comes to what you can say in the classroom. My mother is a teacher as well. I mean, you have a great amount of influence and power over our children. Even my very own, when I'm in that world, my children still hinge on every single thing a teacher will say to them. So I just encourage you to continue to lift them up and build them up. And we understand that you are are facing incredible odds right now with how society is and the messaging that is being distributed out there. There's important in a message when it comes to getting everybody on the same page. Ours, we talk about taglines. I see the tagline for the teach right here. Ours is all hands in.
All hands in.
All hands in is our tagline for all hands in. And you can understand what that represents when it comes to community schools. It doesn't matter who you are, what your past is, you can contribute in some way to making our children's future a lot better.
I like that a lot.
Yeah.
Is that our photographer right here?
All hands in.
Yeah, do mine? We got to wrap. She's not ready. No. She wasn't ready. Hi, Loretta. Is there another organization that needs the room? Just this. I want to say this. It's hard. We wake up every morning, you see the news, you see the daunting things that we're facing every day. But it's conferences like this, and it's people like you and all of you. I feel better. I feel better right now having spent this day with you guys and having listened to you talk. I feel ready. I'm fired up. I'm ready to go. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for the work that you do. Thank you. Thank all of you. Thank you, Loretta.
So let's thank this dynamic panel